Unfortunately, most people do not seem to realize this fact, and therefore they go blithely on their way as though nothing had changed. I'm reminded of the story told by Friedrich Nietzsche, the great atheist of the 19th century, who proclaimed the death of God. Nietzsche tells the story of a madman who in the early morning hours burst into the marketplace, lantern in hand, crying, "I seek God! I seek God!" And since many of those standing about didn't believe in God, he provoked much laughter. "Maybe God has gone on a voyage or emigrated," they laughed. And so they taunted him and mocked him. And then, writes Nietzsche, the madman turned in their midst and pierced them with his eyes. "Whither is God?" he cried. "I shall tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how have we done this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What did we do when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually, backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space has not become colder? Is not night and more night coming on all the while? Must not lanterns be lit in the morning? Do we not hear anything yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? God is dead, and we have killed him. How shall we, the murderers of all murderers, comfort ourselves?" The crowd stared at the madman in silence and astonishment, and at last he smashed his lantern to the ground. "I have come too early," he said. "This tremendous event is still on its way. It has not yet reached the ears of men." You see, men did not truly comprehend what they had done in killing God. But Nietzsche predicted that someday people would realize the consequences of atheism. And this realization would usher in an age of nihilism. That is to say, the destruction of all meaning and value in life. The end of Christianity, wrote Nietzsche, means the advent of nihilism. This most gruesome of guests is standing already at the door. Our whole European culture is moving for some time now, wrote Nietzsche, with a tortured tension that is growing from decade to decade as toward a catastrophe, restlessly, violently, headlong, like a river that wants to reach its end, that no longer reflects, that is afraid to reflect. Most people still do not reflect upon the consequences of secular atheism, and therefore, like the crowd in the marketplace, go unknowingly on their way. But when we realize, as Nietzsche did, the consequences of what atheism implies, and when we stare atheism unflinchingly in the face, as Nietzsche had the courage to do, then his question presses hard upon us. How shall we, the murderers of all murderers, comfort ourselves? Well, it seems to me that confronted with this predicament, we have basically three alternatives. Number one, commit suicide. Faced with the absurdity of life, one should simply end it now. Camus considered suicide to be the only serious philosophical question. Is it worth it to go on living? And sometimes we hear of people who answer no. In the United States, the leading cause of death among teenagers today is suicide. But for most of us, suicide is not the answer. The pleasures that life does afford and the fear of the unknown compel us to go on living. The second alternative is to face the absurdity of life and to live bravely. Atheist philosopher Bertrand Russell said, for example, that only upon the firm foundation of unyielding despair can the soul's habitation be henceforth safely built. Camus said that we should simply recognize the absurdity of life and then live in love for one another. But the problem with this alternative is that it is impossible to live consistently and happily within the framework of such a worldview. Man cannot live as though life had no meaning, value, and purpose. And so what people subconsciously do is to assume that their lives have meaning, value, and purpose, even though they have no right to, since modern man does not believe in God. And what I'd like to do is to look again at each of those three areas in which we saw that life is absurd without God, and to show how modern man fails to live consistently and happily within this worldview. First, the area of meaning. We saw that without God, life is ultimately meaningless. And yet philosophers continue to live as though life does have meaning. For example, Jean-Paul Sartre argued that one may create meaning for his life by freely choosing some course of action. Sartre himself chose Marxism. Now, this program is utterly inconsistent. It is inconsistent to say on the one hand that life is absurd, and then to say on the other hand that one may create meaning for his life. For if life is objectively absurd, then man is trapped. Without God, there can be no objective meaning in life. Sartre's program is actually an exercise in self-delusion, for the universe doesn't really acquire a meaning just because I happen to give it one. And I think this is obvious. For suppose you give the universe one meaning and I give it another. Who's right? Well, I think the obvious answer is neither one. For the universe in and of itself remains intrinsically meaningless, regardless of how we happen to regard it. Sartre is really saying, let's pretend that the universe has meaning. And this is just fooling yourself. The point is this: if God does not exist, then life is objectively meaningless. But mankind cannot live consistently and happily as though life were meaningless. And so in order to be happy, he invents certain purposes and projects for life, and he pretends that these invest his life with meaning. But this is, of course, entirely inconsistent. For without God, man and the universe are ultimately without significance. Turn next to the problem of value. This is where the most blatant inconsistencies occur. First of all, atheistic humanists are totally inconsistent in holding to the values of human love and brotherhood. Camus has been rightly criticized for inconsistently holding to the absurdity of life on the one hand and to the ethics of human love and brotherhood on the other. The two are logically incompatible. As one philosopher has written, it is impossible to generate an ethic of brotherly love out of a philosophy of nihilism. Bertrand Russell, too, was inconsistent. For although he was an atheist, Russell was also an outspoken social critic, denouncing war and restrictions on sexual freedom. Russell admitted that he could not live as though moral values were simply the subjective expressions of personal taste, and that he therefore found his own views, and I quote, incredible. I do not know the solution, he confessed. The point is that if there is no God, then absolute right and wrong do not exist. As Dostoevsky said, all things are permitted. But Dostoevsky also showed that man cannot live this way. He shows this, for example, in his novel Crime and Punishment, in which a young atheist brutally murders an old woman, though he knows that on his presuppositions he should not feel guilty. Nevertheless, he is consumed with guilt until he finally confesses his crime and gives his life to God. In his masterpiece, The Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky tells of how a man murders his father because his brother, Ivan, had told him that God does not exist, and therefore there are no moral absolutes. The man tells Ivan that it was really Ivan himself who murdered their father, since it was Ivan who said that moral absolutes are illusory. Unable to live with the logical consequences of his own system, Ivan suffers a mental collapse. Man cannot live as though moral values do not exist. He cannot live as though it's perfectly all right for soldiers to slaughter innocent children. He cannot live as though it's all right for dictatorial regimes to follow systematic programs of physical torture of political prisoners. He cannot live as though it's perfectly all right for dictators like Pol Pot or Slobodan Milosevic to ruthlessly commit ethnic cleansing and genocide against their own people. Everything in him cries out to say that these acts are wrong, really wrong. But if God does not exist, he cannot. And therefore, he makes a leap of faith and affirms values anyway. And when he does so, he reveals the inadequacy of a world without God. The horror of an atheistic universe was brought home to me powerfully a few years ago through a BBC television documentary called The Gathering. It featured interviews with survivors of the Holocaust